All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic you guys seem really fired up about: global financial power dynamics. You've sent us a pretty fascinating mix of stuff. We've got some wild economic predictions.
Oh, yeah.
Historical analysis, even some pretty strongly worded political commentary in the mix. So
It's going to be a wild ride.
yeah, we're going to try to make sense of it all.
Right, fair, yeah.
We're focusing on the UK and the US, so buckle up.
I think what's really interesting is how all of these seemingly unrelated things, economic forecasts, political statements, they all connect in a way that, helps us understand these big trends.
Okay, so let's start with this interview with Alex Krainer. He was on Commodity Culture, and he's a financial analyst, right? Mm-hmm. And he predicts a potential economic collapse of the UK.
Yeah, he really doesn't mince words. He points to some really specific factors: weakening pound, rising interest rates, and the UK government's just having to borrow more and more to cover its expenses. These are all, pretty concerning signs.
He even compares it to the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic statement.
It is, but it's an attention getter, right? I mean, when you look at the underlying dynamics, there are some interesting parallels. I mean, think about it. Both the Roman Empire, the UK at one point, major global powers, huge empires, complex financial systems. And in both cases, you see this kind of similar pattern of overextension, unsustainable debt, and ultimately a loss of confidence in their currencies.
Okay. So it's not so much about togas and chariots, right? It's more about just kind of how empires rise and fall.
Exactly. It's about that broader pattern. And one of the key mechanisms of that decline is what Krainer calls a death spiral.
Oh, here we go.
Right, jargon, financial jargon. But it's not really that complicated. It's a pretty straightforward idea. Imagine a government already deeply in debt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? They have to pay interest on that debt, right? So how do they do that? They borrow even more money, which, of course, further increases their debt burden. And so it becomes this vicious cycle. And it can spiral out of control and lead to a collapse.
Yeah. So it's like if you have a credit card and your balance is just way too high.
Oh, great analogy.
And you're only making those minimum payments, Yeah. And those payments are barely covering the interest, so the balance just keeps growing.
Exactly. And that's what happens with governments, too. When they get trapped in this spiral, all these other negative things can happen. Runaway inflation, the currency value plummets, investors lose confidence. It's a real problem.
And Krainer thinks the UK is heading down that path.
He's seeing the warning signs. It's definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, here's what's even more interesting. He connects this UK thing to something that seems completely unrelated at first glance. There's this proposal to shift the clearing of US Treasury Futures to the UK.
Okay, wait, back up. US Treasury Futures clearing. Right. Like in plain English, what is that?
Okay. So US Treasury Futures, they're basically contracts that let investors buy and sell US government debt, but at a future date.
So they're kind of betting on the future price of U.S. debt.
Yeah, you could think about it like that.
Okay.
And clearing is basically just the process of making sure those transactions go smoothly, that the buyers and sellers actually do what they're supposed to do.
Okay, like a referee, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really important for the whole system to work.
And they're talking about moving this from the U.S. to the U.K.
Yes, and that's what's got people talking.
Okay, why?
Well, it kind of reminds people of things that happened in the past. Krainer mentions this book, The Great Red Dragon. It details how British financial interests basically took control of a lot of U.S. assets back in the 19th century.
Yeah, and that didn't go so well, right?
No, it didn't.
He was talking about farmers being forced into bankruptcy,
right,
and British interests ended up taking their land, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's exactly what's making people nervous now. Like, could history repeat itself, even if it's in a different form?
So it's not just about the technical stuff, it's about who's in control, right? Who holds the power in the system.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because one of the things to consider is collateral. Collateral is basically an asset that's pledged as security for a loan or a contract. In this case, the collateral backing those U.S. Treasury futures would potentially be under the control of the Bank of England.
So if the UK is having its own economic problems, as Krainer says, wouldn't that make people even more worried about giving them this kind of power over such a critical part of the financial system?
That's a great question. It's exactly why this proposal is creating so much debate. We have to think about the potential benefits and risks for both the U.S. and the UK, particularly when it comes to control of this collateral.
Okay. Speaking of potential risks. What about Donald Trump's return to the presidency? You included some of his recent pronouncements. They're definitely causing a stir.
Yeah, his statements have been quite assertive. Russia, China, even Canada seems like he's taking a hard line with just about everyone.
Yeah. He even went head-to-head with Putin, told him, end this war in Ukraine or face more sanctions. But didn't he campaign on, like, ending the war?
It seems like a contradiction, right? But
Yeah.
Krainer points out something really interesting. Trump's focus during his first term on Ukraine implementing the Minsk agreements.
Right, right. Those agreements were supposed to de-escalate the conflict in eastern Ukraine, find a way to end it peacefully.
But they were also widely seen as being more favorable to Russia.
Okay, so are you saying Trump's tough talk is actually about trying to get a specific outcome, like getting Ukraine to finally accept those Minsk agreements,
Right.
rather than like just trying to punish Russia?
It's definitely a possibility. Think about how quickly things escalated when Biden took office. Seems like he just abandoned any pressure on Ukraine to implement those agreements.
It's like good cop, bad cop, but on a global scale.
Right. So the question is, what was Trump's real strategy? Was this calculated? A way to push Ukraine into negotiations? Or was it just bluster, bravado?
And now will he try to pick up where he left off?
It's hard to say, but if he does, it could have some major implications for the war and maybe even the whole global scene.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Krainer suggests that those long-standing alliances in the Middle East might be undergoing a big shift.
Yeah, he's arguing that the rise of these new global powers, especially Russia and China, is reshaping everything, and Israel might find itself caught in the middle.
I really like that term you use, beachhead states, countries that are kind of like a base of operations for projecting power in a region.
It's a really good way to think about it, isn't it? It helped us understand how countries get used as pawns in these bigger geopolitical games. Krainer thinks that's exactly how Israel was originally established as a beachhead state for the West in the Middle East.
A way to secure Western influence in a region that's vital for oil and other resources.
Exactly. But as the balance of power shifts globally, Israel's position becomes a lot more precarious. Those old alliances that protected them for so long, well, they might not be so strong anymore.
So it's not just about land or religion. It's about this global power struggle. It's about who controls the resources.
Exactly. You have to understand that bigger context to make sense of what's happening now and what might happen in the future.
Now, if we connect this back to the UK's economic troubles and that proposal to move the US Treasury Futures clearing, it's starting to feel like we're seeing a bigger trend here, the decline of Western dominance and the rise of these new global players.
That's a really key takeaway for sure. The world's in a state of change, and these are just glimpses into how economics, politics, and history all intersect as this new world order starts to take shape.
It's both fascinating and kind of unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it reminds us that we need to stay informed, adapt, and be open to new ways of thinking if we want to navigate these uncharted waters.
Okay, before we go any further, let's look more closely at Krainer's analysis of Israel's role as this beachhead state and how that fits into this bigger picture of financial power. He makes a very convincing argument that Israel was never just about creating a homeland for the Jewish people. It was also, at least partly, about the West controlling this strategically important and resource-rich region.
Yeah, and it really challenges the traditional narrative, doesn't it?
He even goes back to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the one that promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Right.
He suggests that British financial interests, who saw a chance to gain control of the region's resources, really heavily influenced that.
It's a pretty provocative argument.
It makes it sound, I don't know, more like a power play by some elite group and less like a humanitarian effort.
Krainer's point is that financial interests and geopolitical strategy often go hand in hand, and understanding that connection is really important for making sense of history.
So the creation of Israel, which, we often think of as this political and ideological thing, was actually influenced by these financial undercurrents.
That's exactly Krainer's point, and it's one worth thinking about.
This is already giving me a totally new perspective on the conflict. It's not just about Israel and Palestine. It's a piece in a much larger puzzle of global power and who controls the resources.
Exactly. And as that puzzle gets reshuffled with these new powers like China and Russia, Israel's position becomes more and more uncertain. Those traditional Western alliances that have backed them for decades, they might be weakening. And that could have huge implications for the conflict going forward.
Like watching this giant game of chess where the board's getting bigger and new players are making moves that change the whole game.
Yeah.
But if we follow that line of thinking, wouldn't the UK, as a traditional Western power, also be vulnerable in this shifting landscape?
That's a great question, and it brings us back to those economic worries we talked about earlier. Krainer's analysis of the UK's potential economic problems and his critique of that US Treasury Futures proposal, they both suggest that even the most established Western powers are not immune to change.
So they're trying to, maneuver for advantage in this new world order, but they're also dealing with their own internal problems and vulnerabilities.
Exactly. It's a complex situation, constantly changing, and it's unfolding right in front of us.
That's what makes it so interesting to try to understand, right?
Absolutely.
I'm already starting to see how these seemingly separate pieces connect to show these bigger trends. Just like you were saying at the beginning, we've gone from the UK economy to US Treasury futures to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's all kind of woven together.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in the material you sent.
Before we get into all that, what stands out to you as the most significant connection so far?
I think for me, it's this idea that we're witnessing a really fundamental shift in global power. That old order, led by the US and its allies, is being challenged by these rising powers like China and Russia. And it's not just about military power or political influence, it's about who controls the money, who has access to resources, and who gets to make the rules.
It's exciting and a little bit scary, right?
Definitely.
Feels like we're at this historical crossroads, and we don't know what path we're going to end up on.
That's exactly it. And that uncertainty is why it's so important to understand these underlying forces. The better we understand what's happening, the better we can navigate the challenges and the opportunities that are coming our way.
Well said. Okay, let's take a closer look at what Krainer calls the insecurity architecture created by Western powers in the Middle East. He argues that this system that was designed to ensure that they controlled the region's resources, it's starting to crumble.
He doesn't paint a very pretty picture. He talks about a region that's deliberately kept in a state of conflict with allies like Israel placed strategically to serve as pawns in a larger game.
Like a high-stakes game of Risk, where everyone's fighting over the key territories.
Exactly. But in this game, the stakes are much higher. We're talking about real lives, real resources, and the balance of power on a global scale. And Krainer believes that this insecurity architecture is breaking down because of these new powers, like Russia and China, who want to create their own world order.
So it's not just about these specific conflicts we see in the headlines. It's about this deeper struggle for control, a battle to reshape the whole global landscape.
Exactly. So it's really important to understand what these emerging powers want and what their strategies are. They're not just reacting to the West. They're actively going after their own goals and agendas.
Greener also talks about a key tactic that Western powers have used to maintain control, turning other countries' resources into collateral, something they can control.
Yeah, he describes it as a system where Western banks basically lend money to developing countries to help them develop their resources, but then those resources are used as collateral for even more loans and investments.
It creates this cycle of debt and dependence.
Exactly, and it can be incredibly profitable for the lenders, but it can trap countries in a really tough spot.
So again, it's not just about military might or political influence.
Right.
It's about financial control. The people who control the money control the game.
It's a classic truth. And today, that control is mostly concentrated in the hands of a few powerful institutions and individuals. Krainer argues that this isn't sustainable. He says it's actually hurting the global economy.
He seems to be calling for a more equitable system, one that doesn't depend on exploitation and debt.
Yes. He thinks a more balanced and fair system would help everyone in the long run. But achieving that kind of change, that's a huge challenge.
He feels like the whole system's rigged to benefit the people who are already in power.
It's definitely an uphill battle, but awareness is the first step. By understanding how the system works, we can start to challenge it and push for change. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah. And sometimes just knowing the rules of the game can give you a little bit of an edge. So let's keep digging into these sources and see what else we can find.
That's the spirit of a true deep diver. Always curious, always searching for deeper understanding. Now let's get back to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Krainer offers a really interesting perspective on how the rise of these new powers, Russia and China, might be impacting the situation.
Yeah, he suggests that Israel's traditional role as this close Western ally is becoming less valuable as the global power balance shifts.
As these new powers become more influential in the region, Israel's strategic importance to the West decreases, and that could have serious implications for what happens with the conflict.
So it's not just about ideology or historical grievances anymore. It's also about this real politic, this changing geopolitical landscape.
Exactly. And it's entirely possible that this shifting landscape could force Israel to rethink their current approach and look for new alliances.
It's like a game of musical chairs, and the music's about to stop. Everyone's scrambling to find a seat.
What a great analogy. And the question is, who will be left standing when the music stops playing?
Now, Krainer doesn't shy away from controversy. He even tackles the sensitive issue of how Israel treats the Palestinians.
He uses some very strong language. He describes it as a form of captivity, and he argues that the Palestinians don't have many options left besides resisting, even if that resistance inevitably leads to violence.
He even mentions the Israeli Defense Force using snipers against unarmed Palestinian protesters. That paints a pretty disturbing picture.
It does, and it's a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict and the deep resentment and anger on both sides.
He also brings up the idea of false flag attacks. Suggests that the recent Hamas attack might have been planned with the help of outside forces who want to make the region even more unstable.
That's a bold claim, and it's important to remember that this is just one perspective, one interpretation of events. But it does raise some important questions. What were the motivations behind that attack? Were there other players in the region who might benefit from the chaos?
It's like a spy novel. You can never be quite sure who to trust or what their real motives are.
Exactly. And in this case, the stakes couldn't be higher. This is a conflict that's been going on for decades with no easy solutions in sight.
And if we think about it in terms of those shifting global power dynamics, the situation becomes even more complex and unpredictable. New players are getting involved, those old alliances are weakening, and the potential for things to escalate is growing.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why it's so important to understand the history, the current players, and their motivations. Knowledge is our best defense against being caught off guard.
Okay, let's change gears one last time and talk about Donald Trump's relationship with Israel. Krainer offers a really surprising take on this. He says that Trump might not be as pro-Israel as many people think.
He points out that Trump has a history of making statements that seem to contradict each other. And he suggests that Trump's tough talk towards Putin might actually be for a domestic audience, rather than directed at Russia itself.
So you mean like he's playing a bit of a political game?
Yeah.
Using strong rhetoric to appeal to certain groups of American voters, but not actually planning to confront Russia?
It's possible, especially when you think back to how he handled foreign policy in his first term. Remember, Krainer reminds us that Trump pressured Ukraine to implement those Minsk agreements, which, as we discussed, were not good for Russia.
So he talks tough, but his actions in the past suggest a different approach, a more nuanced approach.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to look beyond just his words. We have to look at his actions, too. What did he actually do during his first term? How did his policies impact things on the ground? That's what really matters.
Actions speak louder than words.
It's an old saying, but it's true. And it applies to all leaders, not just Trump. We need to be careful consumers of information, always looking for those underlying motives and agendas that drive political decisions.
Okay. Krainer also challenges the idea that Trump is this diehard Zionist who supports Israel no matter what. He thinks Trump might have a more pragmatic view, recognizing that Israel's strategic importance is fading as that global power balance shifts.
Right, and he even goes as far as to suggest that Trump might not like Benjamin Netanyahu very much. Points out that Netanyahu was really quick to congratulate Biden after the 2020 election, which some people saw as a sign of a rift between them.
That's a really interesting thought. It makes our understanding of Trump's foreign policy even more complicated. He's not an easy guy to figure out.
That's for sure. He's definitely a complex figure. His motivations and strategies are often hard to understand. Sometimes they even seem contradictory.
So, yeah, it seems like we're living in interesting times. The world's in a state of flux, the old order is fading, and the future is uncertain. But it's also a time full of possibilities, a chance to reshape the world into something better and more sustainable.
I agree, and that's why it's so important to think deeply about these complex issues, try to understand the forces at play, and figure out our own place in this changing world.
Okay, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot, from the UK's economic struggles to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we even touched on some pretty controversial things along the way.
That's what makes the deep dive so interesting. We're not afraid to tackle the tough questions and look at things from different angles.
Now, before we move on to the next part, we want to hear from you, our listener. What has stood out to you so far? What are you thinking about all this?
We're always interested in hearing your thoughts and perspectives.
So, take some time to think about what we've talked about today. How could these global changes affect your own world, your own choices?
We'll be back soon to continue exploring these fascinating topics.
Until then, keep thinking, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're picking up where we left off, exploring those fascinating and sometimes a little unsettling connections between global power and all these other events. Ready to dive back in?
Absolutely. We've got a lot more to uncover.
Okay, before we get too far, I want to go back to something Krainer said that really stuck with me. He talked about America facing this choice in the New World Order. Either be a polite guest at the global banquet or a thug trying to, boss everyone around. What do you think about that analogy?
It's pretty striking, isn't it? It really captures this tension that's always there in American foreign policy. On one hand, there's this growing recognition that the days of America being the sole superpower are kind of over. The world's becoming more multipolar, new powers are emerging, and we need to be more collaborative.
But it's tough to let go of old habits, right?
Yeah, it's not easy.
There's this deep-seated sense of American exceptionalism, this idea that the U.S. should be the one calling the shots globally.
It's definitely there. That instinct to lead, to be dominant, it's a big part of American history and culture. So it's not surprising that we see these two impulses, collaboration and dominance, kind of fighting it out when it comes to foreign policy.
Krainer seems to be arguing for a more restrained approach. He says America's pursuit of global dominance has been costly and ultimately hasn't really worked.
He makes some good points. Maintaining all those military bases around the world, it's incredibly expensive, and it often has these unintended consequences. Military interventions, even when they're supposed to be for good, they can end up destabilizing entire regions and making things worse.
So it's not just about the money, it's about the human cost too.
Exactly. The casualties, the long-term effects of military action. Krainer seems to think America would be better off focusing on its own problems, the economy, infrastructure, social divisions, and taking a more cooperative, less interventionist approach to foreign policy.
It's a perspective we don't hear often enough, do we? Especially with all the partisan politics and, the constant talk of military action.
It's definitely a perspective worth considering, though, especially as the world becomes more complex and interconnected.
Speaking of complex, I want to go back to the UK's economic situation.
Yeah.
You were saying that some pretty big names in finance share Krainer's worries about this death spiral thing.
Yeah, Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. He's also concerned about the UK's economy. He's seeing the same red flags that Krainer's pointing to. The weak currency, rising interest rates, growing government debt.
So it's not just some fringe idea. Even people who are, really invested in the markets are worried.
Exactly. And Krainer helps us understand why they're worried. He breaks down the factors involved, the weakening currency, rising interest rates, that mountain of government debt, and this growing lack of confidence in the financial system.
And he ties it all back to that proposal to move US Treasury Futures clearing to the UK. He's saying that could actually make the UK's economy even more unstable.
Yeah, his main concern is that if the Bank of England takes on this responsibility, it would give them more control over a really critical part of the global financial system. And while that might seem like a good thing on the surface, Krainer thinks it could backfire, potentially increasing the UK's exposure to all these global risks.
So it's not just about efficiency or, technical expertise. It's about power. Who's pulling the levers?
Exactly. And in a world where the balance of power is shifting, every decision matters. Controlling key parts of the financial system, like the clearing of US Treasury futures, could give the UK an advantage, but it could also make them more vulnerable.
It's a gamble. And who knows if it'll pay off?
That's the thing, isn't it? It shows just how high the stakes are in these global power games. The choices leaders make today, whether it's in the UK, the US, or anywhere else, they'll have consequences for years to come.
It's like playing chess, where every move can change the whole game. And in chess, you have to anticipate your opponent's moves. In this case, understanding the motivations and strategies of those emerging powers is absolutely essential for navigating this changing global landscape.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We're not just watching things happen. We're trying to understand the forces that are driving them, the things that are shaping the world.
I'm starting to see what you mean about those seemingly unrelated events connecting to reveal these bigger trends. We've gone from the UK's economic anxieties to the intricacies of US Treasury futures to those complexities in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's all starting to weave together.
That's the beauty of going deep. It lets us go beyond the surface, beyond the headlines, and see those hidden patterns and connections that shape our reality. And sometimes those connections can be surprising, even unsettling.
Yeah, they can definitely make you think.
That's the nature of truth, though. It's not always comfortable. It's not always easy to accept, but it's absolutely necessary if we want to understand our world.
Now let's get back to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I gotta say, Krainer's analysis of how Israel treats the Palestinians was pretty disturbing.
It was.
He doesn't hold back, calls it a form of captivity, and says the Palestinians have been left with very few options other than to resist, even though that resistance almost always leads to violence.
It's a perspective we don't often hear in the mainstream media. But it's important to listen to those voices, to acknowledge the suffering and the injustice that have fueled this conflict for so long.
He even suggests that the Hamas attack could have been a false flag operation, something orchestrated by outside forces who want to create more instability in the region.
That's a serious accusation, and it needs more investigation. But it does make you wonder who benefits from chaos and violence. Who's really pulling the strings?
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. The deeper you go, the more complex and confusing it gets.
Right. And the more you realize those simple narratives, good guys, bad guys, they just don't capture the whole truth of the situation.
You mentioned that the rise of China and Russia is shaking things up, creating new challenges for those beachhead states like Israel. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. As China and Russia become more powerful, they're challenging that old Western-dominated order. And this is happening in a lot of ways, economically, militarily, and diplomatically.
So it's not just about military strength or economic power.
Right. It's about ideology, too.
It's about having different ideas about how the world should be run.
Exactly. China, for instance, has that Belt and Road Initiative. It's a huge infrastructure project that's expanding their influence all across Asia, Africa, even into Europe. And Russia's asserting itself in their own backyard, as we've seen in Ukraine. They're also building stronger ties with countries like Iran and China.
So for a country like Israel that's traditionally relied on close ties with the US and other Western powers, this new situation creates some serious problems.
Yeah, their strategic value is going down as the U.S. focuses on countering China and Russia. And that means Israel has to find new ways to protect its interests and navigate this increasingly complicated geopolitical landscape.
It's like the ground is shifting under their feet, and they have to figure out how to stand firm in this new, unfamiliar territory.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these global power dynamics is so important. They're not just abstract ideas. They have real consequences. They affect everything from international relations and economics to, the lives of everyday people.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one last thing from Krainer that I want to bring up. He had this interesting take on Donald Trump's relationship with Israel.
Oh, yeah. He challenged that whole idea of Trump being this staunch supporter of Israel, suggested that their relationship was more complicated, maybe even more transactional than it seems.
So he's not the diehard Zionist that some people make him out to be.
Krainer argues that Trump's actions often don't match his words. Remember how he pressured Ukraine to go with those Minsk agreements? That was during his presidency. And those agreements were actually seen as being more beneficial to Russia, not Israel.
So he might talk tough, but his past actions suggest a more pragmatic approach.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look beyond the surface, the sound bites and the headlines. We have to look at what he actually did. What did he accomplish during his time in office? How did his policies actually affect things?
It's a good reminder that actions often speak louder than words.
Definitely. And that applies to all leaders, not just Trump. We need to be critical thinkers, always considering the underlying motivations and agendas that are driving those political decisions.
Krainer also pushes back against the idea that Trump just blindly supports Israel no matter what. He thinks Trump might have a more realistic view of the situation, recognizing that Israel's strategic importance is declining as the global balance of power shifts.
He even suggests that Trump might not actually like Netanyahu very much, pointing to how quickly Netanyahu congratulated Biden after the 2020 election. Some people saw that as a sign that they weren't on good terms.
It's fascinating. It makes Trump's foreign policy even more difficult to understand. He's a complicated guy.
He is. His motivations and strategies are often unclear, sometimes even contradictory.
That makes him both interesting and, maybe a little dangerous.
Yeah.
It's hard to predict what he'll do, which means there's always the risk of miscalculation and unintended consequences. So yeah, we're definitely living in interesting times. The world's changing, the old order is breaking down, and the future's uncertain. But it's also a time full of possibility, a chance to create a better, more just and sustainable world.
I agree. And that's why it's so important to engage with these complex issues, try to understand them, and figure out what role we want to play in this changing world.
Okay, I think that's a good place to take a break. We've covered a lot, from the UK's economic troubles to the complexities of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we've talked about some pretty controversial things along the way.
That's what makes the deep dive so interesting. We're not afraid to ask those tough questions and look at things from all angles.
Now, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, we want to hear from you, our listener. What stood out to you so far? What are your thoughts?
We're always eager to hear your perspectives.
Take a moment to reflect on what we've talked about. How could these global changes affect your world, your own choices?
We'll be back soon to continue exploring these fascinating topics.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've explored these massive global power shifts, economic anxieties, and these simmering conflicts around the world. Now let's try to bring it all home. How might these global forces impact your world?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, right? I mean, the scale of all this is huge. But the goal isn't to make you anxious. It's to help you understand. Think of it like this. We've given you a map that shows the potential dangers and opportunities. Now you get to chart your course.
I love that. It puts the listener in control.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right? And the more you understand, the better equipped you are to make good decisions and face those challenges head on.
So instead of feeling stuck, our listeners should feel empowered to act.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that you're not just watching this happen, you're a part of it. You can shape your future.
Okay, let's get specific. Say someone's worried about the UK's economic future. What can they do?
Well, nobody can predict the future, but understanding the economic factors, the potential risks, that can help you make smarter financial decisions. Maybe diversify your investments, explore opportunities in different markets. That could be a good move.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And stay informed. Keep up with current events and economic trends so you can adjust your strategy as things change.
Makes sense. What about these global power shifts? How can people navigate that?
Again, it's all about being informed and being adaptable. Pay attention to the rise of China, Russia. Think about how their growing influence could affect your life, both personally and professionally.
So it's not just about reading headlines, it's about thinking about the ripple effects, right?
Exactly. For example, let's say your business depends on global supply chains. You need to be aware of how those trade patterns are shifting. Or maybe you're in a field that's becoming more competitive. You might want to think about collaborating with these new players.
It's almost like learning a new language or adapting to a new culture.
That's a great way to think about it. The world's becoming more interconnected, and building those bridges with other cultures, other nations, is essential.
Okay. Now, these conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, can individuals actually make a difference there?
It's easy to feel helpless when you see those huge conflicts. But remember, even small actions can have a big impact. Stay informed, have thoughtful discussions, support organizations that are promoting peace and understanding. All of that can contribute to a better outcome.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that we're not just watching this all happen.
Yeah.
We're part of it. We have a role to play.
Exactly. Don't underestimate the power of individual action. Every voice matters. Every effort counts.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from all of this?
The world is changing, and the old ways of doing things, they don't work anymore. New powers are rising, and that's creating ripples everywhere. To navigate this new world, we have to be informed, we have to adapt, and we have to be willing to question what we think we know.
I like that. It's not about knowing what the future holds. It's about being ready for anything.
That's it. And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive. We've given you the knowledge and the tools to make sense of the world, even when things are uncertain and changing.
It's like we've given you a compass to guide you through the storm.
Perfect analogy. And remember, even in the worst storms, that compass always points north. Now, one last thought-provoking idea from Krainer before we go. He argues that those traditional beachhead states, the ones that have relied so heavily on the West, their model just isn't sustainable anymore.
So as those alliances weaken, what happens to them? Do they become more vulnerable?
That's the big question. Krainer says they have a choice to make. Adapt to the new world order, find new partners, or risk being left behind as the balance of power shifts.
It's like they're standing on a shrinking island, with the tide coming in.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for them to be proactive, to see those changes coming, and to make smart decisions that'll keep them safe and prosperous in the long run.
So if we apply that to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it gets even more complicated, right? If Israel's traditional allies start to back away, it could completely change their approach to the conflict.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that things could go in any direction as this global power struggle plays out.
It's like watching a butterfly come out of its cocoon. You can't know for sure what it's going to look like.
What a beautiful way to put it. We really are in the middle of this incredible transformation, and the final outcome is still uncertain.
Well, this has been an amazing journey, and I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us. We've covered so much ground, from economic predictions to geopolitical strategies, and even how those global shifts could affect you personally.
It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you.
And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. The world's always changing, so we have to stay informed, engaged, and ready to adapt.
Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep looking for new perspectives.
And most importantly, remember that you have the power to make a difference. The future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make every single day.
So go out there and be the change you want to see.